Warning: due to sensitive content, viewer discretion is advised. If you think Namco is just known for maze chase games like Pac-Man and Dig Dug, you're sadly mistaken. Remember, they still had extremely popular space shooters, especially Galaxian and Galaga. As the 1980s rolled around, Namco decided on different kinds of shoot-em-ups. These releases included Xevious, Sky Kid, Dragon Spirit, and the subject of today's video, Phelios. Phelios was released on the Namco System 2 in arcades in February of 1989, in Japan only. There's no solid evidence as to why the arcade game never hit the West, but we'll touch on that later. One thing to note is that handling sound effects for Phelios was Yoshinori Kawamoto, mostly known for his work on the Super Smash Bros. Series. The plot of Phelios is as follows. Artemis, portrayed as a princess rather than goddess of the moon, has been turned into stone by Medusa and taken prisoner by the titan Typhon, a serpentine giant. It's up to the sun god Apollo and his winged horse Pegasus to save the day. Along the way, Apollo has to traverse various stages by shooting projectiles from his sword at enemies. Holding the firing button allows Apollo to shoot larger projectiles. Apollo can take up to 4 hits, depending on the arcade owner's preferences. Taking a hit from an enemy deducts a health bar. Losing the last health bar or hitting a wall in any way knocks Apollo off of Pegasus and costs you a life. Scoring 50,000, 100,000, and 200,000 points awards an extra life. Along the way, you'll come across item flies, gold birds that carry power-ups. Appearing in every chapter are the speed-up power-ups, which boost Apollo's speed for a short period. Option also appears in every chapter, giving Apollo the power to fire an extra projectile in stereo with the one he already has. He can fire up to 4 projectiles at once, but losing a life sets Apollo back to 1. The other 3 power-ups are exclusive to certain chapters and are temporary. Chapter 1 features the beam power-up, which allows Apollo to fire large beams from his sword. Chapter 2, a cross, which lets him fire boomerangs, giving him the ability to hit enemies on the walls. Chapter 4, homing, which lets him fire homing projectiles at his enemies. The life power-up is rare, but picking one up gives Apollo an extra health bar. Each stage features a boss based on or named after a figure in Greek mythology. Chapter 1 takes you to Medusa's lair. Whoops! Wrong show. Apologies to Kirk and Olmec. The boss in Chapter 1 is Medusa, the snake-haired Gorgon who was beheaded by Perseus. She fires laser beams at Apollo from her eyes. Defeating her restores Artemis to normal, but that's just the first stage. Chapter 2, Grey, a trio of sisters who unleash projectiles from their hands until Apollo destroys them. Once the hands are destroyed, their heads will attack Apollo. Their source of power that must be destroyed, the crystal behind them. Chapter 3, the Siren, a winged being who takes the form of a massive eagle and shoots feather projectiles at Apollo, as well as fireballs from her beak. Chapter 4, Antaeus, depicted in the game as a fire deity who showers Apollo with fireballs while his flaming hands also strike. His head is his greatest weakness, but the faster Apollo fires upon him, the more fireballs rain down on him, leaving little room to get by without taking a hit. Chapter 5, Skyla, a head encased in a crystal ball. She nearly resembles a crystal brain from Bakutotsu Kijute, the sequel to Namco's Baraduke. Skyla shields herself with a circle of crystal balls, which can be easy to avoid, but once Apollo passes them by, she'll conjure up walls of destructible spikes to fire at him. Chapter 6, The Three-Headed Cerberus. The heads shoot multiple projectiles at Apollo, and when one head is destroyed, it takes the form of a ricocheting fireball that can't be destroyed. Once all 3 heads are destroyed, Cerberus's fireballs disappear and he's history. Chapter 7. Before we get to the boss, this stage is where the titular power-up comes in. There are item capsules hiding numerous items, including the 7 letters in the name Phelios. Once all 7 are collected, Apollo's sword will be given a powerful charged shot, which is needed to battle the final boss. If you miss one, you'll have to hit a wall so you can start from the beginning. The final boss of the game is Typhon. He starts off by appearing in a cloaked form 7 times, firing homing projectiles at Apollo. Once he's hit 7 times by charged shots, he takes on his massive true form and blasts Apollo with red crystals. The more you shoot at him, the higher up he'll go, making him an easier target. Once he's hit enough times, Typhon will explode, and Apollo is reunited with Artemis. Oh, and there's another thing to note. Apollo and Artemis, in real Greek mythology, are siblings, but in the game, they're portrayed as lovers. As to why Namco did that, we'll never know. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Why was Phelios never released outside of Japan? Again, there's nothing concrete, but it's widely believed that it was due to the cutscenes in which Artemis was tortured by Typhon. On the other hand, there were torture scenes in Namco's Rolling Thunder, and that didn't stop Atari Games from distributing it in the US, nor releasing it on the NES, even though it's an unlicensed cartridge. Oh well, life goes on. The arcade version of Phelios was well received upon its release. In their March 1989 issue, the Japanese magazine Game Machine ranked it number 3 of their 25 best hit games. Now, there are no hard numbers, but I'm sure the game was more than popular enough for Namco to port the game to home consoles. But before we get to that, here's a little history. By the 1980s, Namco was riding high. Their releases on Nintendo's Famicom accounted for around 40% of their revenue. By 1989, their contract as a Nintendo licensee had expired. Now, Namco, being one of the first third-party Nintendo licensees, was given special provisions such as manufacturing and selling their own cartridges. At this point, Nintendo, still trying to avoid the mistakes that caused the video game crash of 1983, was no longer interested in giving any third-party licensees special treatment. All licensees were required to purchase their cartridges from Nintendo with a minimum order of 10,000 cartridges. Namco's president and founder, Masaya Nakamura, was perturbed. He spoke out against Nintendo's terms, claiming they were monopolizing the video game market. He also declared that Namco would begin making games for other consoles, including Sega's new 16-bit system, the Mega Drive, later to be released in North America as the Sega Genesis.
Phelios!
The first game Namco released to Sega's 16-bit system was Phelios, released on July 20th, 1990 in Japan, October of 1990 in North America, and December of 1991 in PAL regions.
A long, long time ago in Greece, there was a brave man who had fought against his enemy for his brother. Mega Drive, Phelios.
Now, considering the Genesis' limitations, it's obvious that some compromises had to be made so Namco could fit Phelios into a single 4-megabit cartridge. For example, the cutscenes. In one torture scene, when Typhon sets her cell ablaze, rather than showing Artemis taking the heat, the console port shows her being lowered down to who knows where. One obvious cutscene in the arcade game has Artemis trying to escape, only to find Typhon blocking her path. The console port doesn't have that. Instead, it has something a little risque after the 4th and 5th boss stages. Artemis is rammed against a brick wall, and when the bricks fall, she's shown wearing a bikini-like top and a loincloth. Typhon's actions are almost similar to those of Jabba the Hutt from the Star Wars series. As Jabba holds Princess Leia prisoner, she's wearing a metal bikini. In the Genesis version of Phelios, Artemis is practically the same, only she doesn't reach Leia's level until after Antaeus is beaten. The text in the console port is entirely in English, even in the Japanese and European releases. The bosses don't expand in the console port. In the second stage, after you defeat those turkey-like enemies, the gate to the dungeon opens, and watch as Apollo zooms through. Unlike the arcade version, which actually scales, the console port has a more primitive way of zooming in on the gate. 10 different frames in under 5 seconds. When you fire upon Antaeus, no matter how many times you hit him, his fireball storm doesn't reach the edges in the console port. Whereas the arcade game has him sending down fireballs all over the place, depending on how much you attack him in so little time. This makes the stage a little bit easier. After killing Cerberus, his fireballs take the form of eyeballs that you have to destroy to beat the stage. In the final stage, the blockading destructible orbs are much bigger and easier to dispose of. Plus you have more room to pass through. The power-ups that grant bonus points don't have any symbols whatsoever. They're just plain blue. You'll only be able to tell how many points you got out of it by looking at the score, but it's best not to lest you lose focus. When you battle Typhon, he has the power to try and shield himself with his wings after taking a certain amount of damage. This gives you the opportunity to shoot at him some more with ease, and while less damage may be done, he'll go up even higher. But once he's out of his shield, he shoots laser beams for a short period of time. In the North American release of the game, you can hear Artemis actually talk in English.
I'm being held in the temple. Save me, quicker!
Yes, it's a little muffled and overall not quite perfect, least of all her shouting.
Listen, Apollo, please.
But that's the best Namco could do to get around hardware limitations. It may have been a different story had Namco ported the game to the Mega CD/Sega CD a few years later. In the Japanese version, after rescuing Artemis, her text says "be patient" repeatedly when she's about to kiss Apollo. For reasons unknown, this was removed from the Western releases. Oh well. Despite these issues, Phelios is certainly one of the best shooters on the Genesis. It may still be challenging, but it's definitely much easier than the arcade version. It's too bad I never experienced the game when it was new. I was only 2 years old then, and I didn't own a console until 1992. When I did, it was the Super Nintendo, not the Sega Genesis. With the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 chip, I'm certain Phelios would have run better on this system. On the other hand, had Namco ported this game to the Super Famicom/Super Nintendo, it probably wouldn't have seen a release outside of Japan. Nintendo of America had a strict policy against violent and provocative content at the time. Plus, there was no ESRB rating system when Phelios first came out. Then again, it wasn't among the games that sparked controversy back in 1993. Mortal Kombat Lethal Enforcers and Night Trap did that. Nevertheless, Phelios really rocked the house on the Genesis, probably even more than it did in arcades. Critics liked the game too. GamePro scored it 21 out of 25, calling it a horse of a different color. They also stated, Phelios, the first Genesis title from well-known game designer Namco, is a first-class cart. Electronic Gaming Monthly rated it a total of 33 out of 40 in issue 15, calling it, quote, one of the better vertical shooters out for the Genesis. Although we never saw another Phelios game, it was never forgotten. Apollo and Artemis became playable characters in the 2002 tactical RPG for Bandai's WonderSwan Color, Namco Super Wars. But will we ever see a true return to the series? Or at least more opportunities to play as Apollo and Artemis? Who knows? As for Namco, they would continue to develop games for the Mega Drive/Genesis, including Burning Force, Marveland, Rolling Thunder 2 and 3, Splatterhouse 2 and 3, and of course, the Pac-Man series. They also put quite a bit of support on Sega's Game Gear. Of course, they still made games for Nintendo's consoles. Despite their strict policies, they renewed their licensing agreement, and it was a good thing too, because a year after the renewal, Nintendo eased their quality control policies. Overall, Phelios is truly an awesome shmup that doesn't deserve to go unnoticed. To play the Genesis/Mega Drive version, it's gonna run you at least $30 for the cartridge alone, and at least $75 for a complete copy. But if you want to play the arcade version, it's available as part of Hamster's Arcade Archive service for the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4. The text in the North American version is still in Japanese, but that's hardly an issue. Nevertheless, we now have a port of Phelios on a Nintendo console. Thanks again for watching Gaming Delight. Until next time, happy gaming!